Have you ever wondered what happens when a mother sacrifices her youth for her son, only to receive a stinging slap on Christmas Eve? At 48, I learned blind devotion is poison. They thought I was a washed-up woman to be evicted from their lavish Austin penthouse. They had no idea I held the master key to their tech empire. Grab a dark coffee. The sweetest revenge is not screaming, but dead silence before the storm. Hello, dear listeners of the James Revenge Stories channel, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently turned off our monetization features, leaving us with absolutely no budget to keep operating. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us with just $1, which will help us pay our dedicated team so they can cover their living expenses and continue bringing you high-quality content. You can make a donation by simply scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the direct PayPal link located in the description or the comments section of this video. My name is Arya Hansen, and I'm 48 years old. The Austin skyline glittered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, a sprawling sea of city lights that rivaled the stars. But inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. It was Christmas Eve, and my son Liam, who was 28, and his wife Chloe, who was 27, were hosting a lavish holiday gala for the tech elite of Texas. From my secluded spot in the dimly lit corner of the expansive living room, I watched them. The room was a symphony of clinking crystal champagne flutes, loud and pretentious laughter, and the subtle hum of a live jazz quartet playing in the background. Women paraded around in custom designer gowns, and men boasted in tailored velvet tuxedos. I sat there in my simple, unbranded beige cashmere sweater and tailored dark slacks, feeling entirely invisible, which of course was exactly how they wanted it. No one in that opulent room knew the truth. They looked at Liam, the charismatic young CEO holding court by the marble fireplace, and saw a tech prodigy. They saw a self-made billionaire who had seemingly pulled the revolutionary startup known as Vanguard Nexus out of thin air. They did not know that behind his polished pitches and aggressive marketing strategies was my brain. I was the silent genius who had spent thousands of agonizing hours writing every single line of the core predictive algorithm that made Vanguard Nexus functional. I had built the engine from scratch in a cramped, unheated garage years ago. But when the time came to launch, I stepped back into the shadows. I wanted Liam to be the face of the company. I wanted my son to have a career he could be proud of, to feel the triumph of building an empire. So I handed him the title of Chief Executive Officer, while I remained completely hidden. As the night wore on, the alcohol flowed freely, and Chloe's true colors began to bleed through her glittering emerald dress. She was already visibly tipsy when she sidled up to a group of powerful Silicon Valley venture capitalists. She caught my eye from across the room, gave a malicious smirk, and pointed her glass in my direction. "Oh, that is just Liam's mother," she laughed, her voice carrying over the music. "She is delightfully rustic, completely out of touch with the modern world. We try to keep her comfortable, but you know how the elderly are." The investors chuckled politely, glancing at me with mild pity. I swallowed the bitter lump in my throat, clutching my glass of sparkling water. But the humiliation did not end there. A few minutes later, Chloe aggressively grabbed my forearm, her sharp manicured nails digging into my skin, and dragged me away from the party and into Liam's private oak-paneled study. She slammed the heavy door shut instantly, cutting off the noise of the gala. She marched over to the mahogany desk, snatched a thick legal document, and shoved it against my chest. "Sign it, Arya," she hissed, her breath reeking of expensive wine. "We are preparing for a massive public offering. We cannot have a nobody like you holding on to that final 1% of hidden founder equity. It complicates the paperwork. Liam wants it gone. I want it gone." I looked at the paperwork, then looked up at her flushed, greedy face. I kept my voice perfectly level, refusing to give her the reaction she desperately craved. "I am not signing anything tonight, Chloe, and I strongly suggest you lower your voice and remember who you are speaking to. A little respect would serve you well." That was the breaking point. Chloe's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated fury. "Respect!" she shrieked. Without a second of hesitation, she hurled the contents of her crystal glass directly at me. The dark, sticky Cabernet Sauvignon splashed violently across my face, soaking into my beige cashmere sweater like a spreading wound. Before I could even process the shock of the cold liquid, her hand swung through the air. A sharp, stinging slap landed square on my cheek. The force of it made my ears ring and flashes of light danced at the edge of my vision. The heavy oak door suddenly swung open. Liam stood in the doorway, drawn by his wife screaming. He looked at Chloe panting and red-faced with her hand still raised. Then he looked at me, his own mother dripping with red wine and sporting a bright, hand-shaped welt across my face. I waited for the horror to wash over his features. I waited for my son to rush forward to reprimand his wife, to ask if I was hurt. Instead, a mask of cold, calculating irritation fell over his face. He did not look at me with an ounce of love. He raised his arm, pointed a rigid finger straight toward the private elevator down the hall, and roared with a voice I did not recognize. "Get out of my house and never come back. You are ruining my future." The silence that followed was absolute. The boy I had raised, the boy I had sacrificed my youth, my career, and my genius for, had just signed his own execution warrant. I did not shed a single tear. I did not utter a word of defense or argue with him. I calmly reached into my pocket, pulled out a pristine white handkerchief, and slowly wiped the wine from my face. I adjusted my ruined sweater, lifted my chin, and walked past them with my back completely straight. I stepped into the elevator and walked out the front doors into the biting, freezing Texas winter night. In that frigid air, the last remaining shred of my maternal tolerance froze over and shattered into dust. The drive away from the glittering downtown skyline was quiet, accompanied only by the rhythmic hum of the taxi tires against the freezing asphalt. I directed the driver to an exclusive, highly discreet boutique hotel nestled far away from the tech district. I checked in under my maiden name, paid in cash for a month-long stay in their finest executive suite, and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. The transition began the moment I dropped my ruined cashmere sweater into the trash. I reached into my purse, pulled out my personal cell phone, and powered it down permanently. I removed the tiny plastic SIM card, snapped it cleanly in half, and tossed it away. That woman, the endlessly accommodating silent martyr of a mother, was dead. From a hidden, zippered compartment deep within my leather travel bag, I extracted a heavy encrypted satellite phone. It was a secure communication device that my son had absolutely no idea even existed. I sat on the edge of the pristine king-sized bed and dialed a private, unlisted number. It rang exactly twice before a sharp, entirely awake voice answered the line, despite the clock showing 2 in the morning on the East Coast. "Good evening, Arthur," I said, my voice as perfectly cold and clear as the frost forming on the window panes. "It is time. We are initiating the sunset clause." Arthur, my senior corporate attorney based in New York, and the single living person who fully understood the staggering architecture of my empire, let out a long, slow breath. "Are you absolutely certain, Arya?" he asked, a hint of solemn respect in his tone. "You know how this works. Once I file these documents, the earth will literally open up and swallow his entire life whole. There is no reversing the domino effect." I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window, tracing the faint red mark still lingering on my cheek. "Do it," I replied softly. 5 years ago, when we first drafted the foundational legal contracts to establish Vanguard Nexus, I had insisted on embedding the sunset clause. It was a brilliant, devastating failsafe. A hidden legal labyrinth buried meticulously beneath hundreds of pages of dense, mind-numbing corporate jargon. Liam, blinded by his own immense arrogance and desperate eagerness to officially plaster his name across the Chief Executive Officer title, had merely skimmed the final paperwork before aggressively signing his name on the dotted line. He never bothered to hire his own independent counsel to review the terms. He had absolutely no idea what he was actually agreeing to that day. The truth of my position was far more terrifying than simply being the brain behind a software patent. I was not just the original developer. I was the anonymous, heavily shielded chairman of the board. I personally held a staggering 80% of the absolute voting power. Liam was nothing more than a glorified, highly paid middle manager, acting entirely on the invisible authority I graciously allowed him to borrow. But the corporate power structure was only half of the trap I had woven. The sickeningly luxurious lifestyle my son and his vicious wife so proudly flaunted was a meticulously constructed mirage. That $10 million Austin penthouse they had just violently expelled me from, it was held in a secure blind trust, and I was the sole legal beneficiary. The fleet of custom-imported sports cars sitting in the private garage, the unlimited platinum credit lines they swiped with reckless daily abandon, and even the corporate private jet they treated as their personal weekend taxicab. Every single one of those assets was legally registered to an umbrella holding company completely controlled by my exclusive signature. They owned absolutely nothing. Over the next 48 hours, while the rest of the world joyfully celebrated the holiday season, my legal and financial teams moved with the ruthless, coordinated precision of a military strike. The execution was entirely silent and devastatingly thorough. I ordered the immediate, unceremonious freezing of every personal bank account, joint savings fund, and investment portfolio tied to Liam's name. We severed his administrative access to the corporate treasury with a few strokes of a keyboard. The final, most fatal blow, however, was directed at the intellectual property itself. With a single injunction filed in federal court, I revoked Vanguard Nexus's operating license to use the core predictive algorithm, legally reverting the total ownership of the code back to my private, independent parent corporation. Vanguard Nexus was instantly gutted, reduced to an empty, worthless shell. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Liam and Chloe were undoubtedly sipping incredibly expensive vintage champagne on a chartered private flight heading straight to Aspen. They were happily embarking on their lavish winter vacation, utterly and foolishly convinced that tossing a helpless middle-aged woman out into the cold was their final triumphant victory. They believed they had successfully eliminated the only obstacle standing between them and total control of the company. Back in the quiet sanctuary of my hotel suite, the noisy, toxic chaos of my previous life felt like a fading, distant memory. The suffocating burden of maternal guilt and unconditional sacrifice had been entirely lifted from my weary shoulders, quickly replaced by an intoxicating, powerful sense of absolute freedom. I spent those 2 days wrapped in a thick plush robe, sitting peacefully by a roaring gas fireplace. I drank rare, expensive Darjeeling tea, read thick classic novels, and quietly mapped out the entire restructuring of my financial portfolio. Every single ounce of warmth, pity, or affection I had ever held for the ungrateful boy I raised had been thoroughly extinguished by that violent slap and his cruel, dismissive words. My heart was completely cold, beating now only to the steady, calculated rhythm of a businesswoman reclaiming her rightful throne. The crisp mountain air of Aspen had barely faded from Chloe's memory before harsh reality hit her like a speeding freight train. Less than 24 hours after their chartered flight landed back in Texas, she strolled into a high-end luxury jewelry boutique downtown, her nose tipped high in the air as if she owned the world. She casually pointed to a dazzling custom-cut diamond tennis bracelet, a piece that carried a price tag of roughly $65,000, and tossed her exclusive black metal credit card onto the polished glass display counter. The impeccably dressed sales associate smiled warmly and swiped the card. A sharp mechanical beep echoed loudly in the quiet store. The terminal flashed bright red. Frowning, the associate tried the chip reader, and then she tried typing the numbers manually. Chloe's haughty smirk vanished quickly, replaced by an ugly, defensive scowl as the associate slid the heavy metal card back across the glass. "I am so sorry, madam," the clerk said, his voice carrying clearly to the other wealthy patrons, who immediately stopped browsing to stare. "Your financial institution has placed a hard lock on this account. Do you have another form of payment?" Chloe turned a violent shade of crimson. Without a word, she snatched the piece of useless plastic back and stormed out of the boutique, her face burning with absolute humiliation. The following morning, the nightmare escalated drastically for Liam. He descended to the private climate-controlled parking garage of his high-rise building, fully intending to jump into his custom-imported Italian sports car to drive to his office and aggressively demand answers from his banking representatives. Instead, he found a heavy-duty municipal tow truck actively backing into his designated VIP parking space. A burly operator in a greasy uniform was securing thick steel chains to the undercarriage of the $500,000 vehicle. The building manager stood nearby, watching with his arms crossed. Liam sprinted forward, screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding they drop his car to the ground immediately. The tow truck operator did not even flinch at the wealthy boy throwing a temper tantrum. He simply pulled a stack of legally certified documents from his bright yellow vest and shoved them hard against Liam's chest. "I do not care who you think you are, buddy," the man grunted, turning back to his winch. The registered legal owner, the Umbrella Holding Corporation, officially terminated the lease agreement at exactly midnight. "You do not own this car. Stand back, or I'm calling the police." Cold, sharp panic finally pierced through Liam's thick layer of arrogance. He sprinted back into the private elevator, his hands shaking so violently he could barely press the glowing button for the penthouse floor. Bursting into the living room, he immediately dialed his private wealth manager, only to be transferred to a sterile, automated message stating his accounts were completely frozen, pending a massive corporate audit. Sweating profusely, he called his chief financial officer at Vanguard Nexus. He barked an order for an immediate emergency wire transfer of $200,000 to his personal checking account to cover his imminent expenses. The phone line went dead silent for a long, agonizing moment. When the CFO finally spoke, his voice trembled but remained resolute. "I cannot do that, Liam. The mainframe locked me out. Actually, it locked you out too. Any transaction over $10,000 now strictly requires a direct encryption key from the anonymous chairman of the board. You have absolutely no authorization rights. You are just a figurehead without that code." Before Liam could even process the horrifying, earth-shattering revelation that he was nothing more than a powerless puppet sitting inside his own supposed empire. A heavy rhythmic pounding shook his front door. He dropped the phone and yanked the door open to find two armed county sheriffs standing shoulder to shoulder with a team of building security guards. One of the officers handed him a thick manila folder. It was an emergency fast-tracked eviction notice legally rubber-stamped by a federal judge. "You and your wife have exactly 30 minutes to vacate these premises," the officer announced loudly, stepping forcefully into the foyer. Chloe came running from the master suite, screaming wildly as the security team began unceremoniously grabbing their expensive designer luggage, throwing armfuls of haute couture clothing, velvet shoes, and rare handbags into the public corridor. The luxurious sanctuary they had violently kicked me out of was no longer theirs to occupy. They were literally tossed out onto the street like garbage. From the serene, quiet comfort of my hotel suite, I sat peacefully by the window with a fresh cup of Earl Grey tea, watching a synchronized cloud server dashboard on my secure tablet. Even though I had destroyed my physical phone, I had cleverly routed all incoming communications from my old number to this encrypted portal. The screen lit up endlessly. First, there were demanding text messages from Liam ordering me to call his bank and fix the stupid clerical error. 2 hours later, the messages morphed into furious, threatening voicemails. He screamed into the microphone, promising to sue me for every penny I had. By nightfall, his hollow threats completely dissolved into sheer, unadulterated terror. Dozens upon dozens of missed calls piled up alongside pathetic, sobbing audio messages. He was spiraling into total psychological madness, entirely unable to comprehend how his golden life had evaporated into thin air in mere hours. I simply muted the tablet's volume, took a slow, satisfying sip of my warm tea, and maintained my absolute suffocating silence. Stripped of their endless cash flow, their exotic cars, and their magnificent home, Liam and Chloe were forced to drag their scuffed, overflowing luxury suitcases through the dirt parking lot of a cheap, rundown roadside motel on the far undesirable outskirts of the city. Their tiny room smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke and damp, rotting carpet. A flickering neon sign outside buzzed loudly against the window pane, casting a sickly, harsh red glow through the thin, stained curtains. Used to sleeping on imported Egyptian cotton and dining on caviar, the sudden brutal reality of poverty broke their spirits instantly. Sitting on the edge of a sagging, creaking mattress, the vicious blame game began. Chloe screamed at the top of her lungs that Liam was a pathetic, weak failure who could not even control his own elderly mother. Liam roared back furiously, blaming her drunken, violent outburst at the Christmas party for triggering my catastrophic wrath. The fragile, superficial bond they falsely called marriage shattered into a million tiny pieces, quickly replaced by venomous insults and bitter, hateful resentment. They were finally experiencing the exact, agonizing hell they deserved. And my game had only just begun. The physical assets and bank accounts were securely locked down, but my corporate empire was fundamentally built on data, and in the modern tech world, data is infinitely more valuable than any imported sports car or penthouse suite. From the heavily encrypted tablet resting on the mahogany desk in my hotel room, I authorized my elite, independent cybersecurity task force to initiate a total forensic sweep of the Vanguard Nexus mainframes. I wanted every single digital footprint meticulously analyzed. Exactly 48 hours into their exhaustive deep dive, my lead security architect flagged a massive, terrifying anomaly. Deep within the client architecture servers, someone had quietly installed a highly sophisticated, completely invisible backdoor protocol. It was a digital siphon, slowly and methodically bleeding out our most sensitive, highly classified consumer algorithms and proprietary user data in tiny, untraceable packets. I sat rigidly in my armchair as the security team traced the invisible network of IP addresses. The stolen data was not just floating aimlessly into the dark web. It was being systematically routed directly into the heavily guarded private servers of Zenith Dynamics, our biggest and most aggressive market competitor. My blood ran cold at the sheer scale of the corporate treason, but the true masterstroke of betrayal was yet to be uncovered. The security team managed to completely bypass the encrypted firewalls of the internal user who had originally installed the backdoor. The login credentials did not belong to a rogue software engineer, a disgruntled mid-level manager, or a faceless hacker. The access codes were tied directly to an executive administrative account. It was Chloe. My daughter-in-law was not merely a vapid, shallow gold digger obsessed with expensive jewelry, designer shoes, and high society galas. She was an active, ruthless, and incredibly calculating industrial spy. While she was smiling for the cameras on the red carpet and spending my hard-earned money with reckless abandon, she was actively gutting the very company that funded her lavish lifestyle. My forensic accountants dug even deeper, relentlessly following the digital money trail provided by Zenith Dynamics. They discovered a complex, shadowy web of offshore transactions leading straight to an untraceable private trust fund sitting inside a highly secure Swiss bank. The account was registered entirely under Chloe's maiden name. She had been secretly stockpiling millions of dollars in untaxed, illicit corporate bribes. Her grand, twisted master plan was entirely clear to me now. She was going to bleed Vanguard Nexus completely dry, push the company into total, unrecoverable bankruptcy, and then take her hidden millions and vanish into the night, leaving my son to take the devastating legal and financial fall. I could have picked up the phone right then and dialed the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had enough ironclad, irrefutable evidence to have her arrested and federally indicted for corporate espionage before lunchtime. But handing her over to the authorities immediately would have been far too merciful. A quick arrest would let Liam play the role of the oblivious victim. I wanted my son to look directly into the true, horrifying face of the monster he had chosen over his own mother. I meticulously compiled every single piece of damning evidence. I printed out the offshore bank statements showing consistent deposits of hundreds of thousands of dollars, the detailed server logs tracing the stolen data drops, and a thick stack of highly explicit email exchanges between Chloe and the rival executives, where she openly and viciously mocked Liam's sheer incompetence while negotiating her massive payouts. I placed the massive stack of papers into a thick, unmarked manila envelope and dispatched a private courier to deliver it directly to Liam. Since he was firmly locked out of the corporate headquarters, he had desperately rented a cheap, depressing desk at a public co-working space downtown to try and salvage his rapidly crumbling public image. According to the private investigator I hired to tail him, Liam received the heavy package at exactly 2 in the afternoon. He tore open the envelope, likely expecting perhaps a legal lifeline or a pathetic settlement offer from my attorneys. Instead, he found the gruesome, undeniable autopsy of his completely fabricated marriage. Liam burst through the flimsy wooden door of their squalid roadside motel room just after 4 o'clock. The cheap veneer door slammed violently against the peeling, water-stained wallpaper. Chloe was sitting casually on the edge of the sagging mattress, aggressively filing her manicured nails, looking utterly bored and disgusted by their miserable surroundings. Liam did not scream right away. He was trembling so violently that the thick stack of papers in his hands rattled loudly together in the quiet room. With a hollow, gasping breath, he threw the entire dossier directly at her face. The printed bank statements and damning emails fluttered across the dirty, stained carpet like dead leaves falling from a rotting tree. "What is this?" he choked out, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of sheer devastation. "Zenith Dynamics. A private Swiss account with $3 million. You have been selling our core architecture to the enemy. You have been destroying me from the inside." Chloe did not flinch. She did not cry. She did not frantically deny the accusations, and she certainly did not beg for his forgiveness. The sweet, loving mask of the supportive tech wife simply evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a cold, terrifyingly sociopathic sneer. She slowly bent down, picked up one of her Swiss bank statements, and casually brushed a speck of dust off the paper. "Oh, please grow up, Liam," she scoffed, her tone dripping with absolute venom and pure condescension. "Did you honestly believe I married you for your brilliant business acumen or your sparkling personality? You are a pathetic, incompetent fraud. You never built a single successful thing in your entire life. You are just a spoiled little boy who played dress-up in a corner office while aggressively leeching off his brilliant mother." Liam staggered backward as if she had physically driven a jagged knife directly into his chest. "I gave you absolutely everything," he whispered hoarsely, tears of shock finally welling in his eyes. "I defended you. I threw my own mother out into the freezing street on Christmas Eve because of you." Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed terribly in the cramped, smelly room. "And that just proves exactly how incredibly stupid you really are. You threw away the golden goose to protect the fox. Vanguard Nexus was totally doomed the second you alienated the only person who actually knew how the machine worked. I just secured my own financial future before your entire ship sank to the bottom of the ocean." She stood up abruptly, grabbed her expensive designer handbag, and walked purposefully toward the door, completely ignoring his shattered, weeping expression. "I am filing for divorce first thing tomorrow morning," she stated coldly, pausing right at the threshold without looking back. "Have fun paying off your massive, insurmountable debts, darling. You are entirely on your own now." The flimsy door clicked shut, sealing his fate. Liam collapsed onto the filthy floor, his knees giving out completely. He sat in the suffocating toxic silence of the cheap motel room, surrounded by the scattered printed evidence of his wife's ultimate betrayal. The horrifying, suffocating reality finally crushed him. The vicious woman he had aggressively protected, the woman for whom he had violently banished his own flesh and blood, had meticulously dug his grave, pushed him inside, and simply walked away laughing. There were exactly 3 days left until the highly anticipated Vanguard Nexus new product gala. Months ago, during a time when his ego was completely unchecked, Liam had grandly scheduled this exact evening to announce a staggering $1 billion initial public offering to the global financial press. Now it was his absolute last desperate breath of air. Stripped of his overflowing bank accounts, violently evicted from his magnificent home, and entirely abandoned by his treacherous wife, my son had nothing left to his name but the hollow, empty title of Chief Executive Officer. To him, the upcoming gala was a fragile, incredibly dangerous lifeline. He foolishly believed that if he could just stand under the bright stage lights and deliver one more charismatic, completely fabricated presentation, he could trick the wealthiest billionaire investors in the room into injecting enough emergency capital to somehow save his rapidly sinking ship. But putting on a luxurious tech gala required massive amounts of liquid cash, something he no longer legally possessed. My elite surveillance team informed me that Liam had resorted to the criminal underworld. He had borrowed $500,000 from a notorious, incredibly violent high-interest loan shark just to pay the venue deposits, the catering staff, and the event planners. He was betting his literal life and his physical safety on this single fabricated night. I watched his pathetic, frantic scramble from the absolute quiet of my hotel suite. The crushing weight of the suffocating silence I had strictly maintained over the past few weeks was nearing its ultimate breaking point. It was winding tighter and tighter inside my chest, like a coiled metal spring entirely ready to snap. It was finally time for me to permanently step out of the shadows. I spent an entire afternoon at an exclusive, highly private boutique in the city center. For decades, I had deliberately dressed in simple, faded clothes, actively shrinking my own presence to make sure Liam's star could always shine the brightest. Not anymore. I purchased a sharply tailored, immaculate, stark white designer power suit. The cut was ruthless, highly elegant, and screamed absolute, unquestionable authority. I paired it with sleek, pointed black leather heels. As I looked deeply into the full-length mirror, the exhausted, invisible mother was completely gone. The true architect of a massive digital empire stared back at me, totally ready to execute her final devastating maneuver. The night of the gala finally arrived, transforming the grand downtown convention center into a dazzling spectacle of extreme wealth and cutthroat corporate power. The massive hall was absolutely packed to the brim with flashing press cameras, cynical technology journalists, and the most powerful venture capitalists in the completely saturated state market. The atmosphere was thick, electric, and incredibly suffocating. Among the vast sea of tailored velvet tuxedos and shimmering evening gowns, a sudden, aggressive murmur rippled through the wealthy crowd near the main entrance doors. Chloe had arrived. She did not come to politely support her crumbling husband, nor did she come to hide in quiet shame. She strolled highly confidently down the crimson carpet, wearing a breathtaking, aggressively expensive red silk dress that commanded every single eye in the room. Clinging tightly to her arm, looking incredibly smug, was the silver-haired chief executive officer of Zenith Dynamics, the exact rival corporation she had illegally sold our proprietary data to. She had successfully secured a highly exclusive VIP invitation, solely to sit comfortably in the front row, to sadistically mock my son, and to happily watch him publicly crash and burn to the ground. Backstage, completely unaware of the trap closing around him, Liam looked entirely haggard. The thick, heavy theatrical makeup violently applied by the styling team could not hide the dark, exhausted circles under his deeply bloodshot eyes or the violent tremors shaking his pale hands. Yet, as the massive house lights finally dimmed and the booming dramatic introductory music began to aggressively play, he desperately pasted on his signature, highly arrogant smile. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, took a massive breath, and stepped confidently out into the blinding hot white spotlights. The massive crowd offered a polite, highly expectant round of applause. Liam walked straight to the center of the stage, gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium tightly, and leaned directly into the silver microphone. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, completely masking the absolute terrifying panic tearing him apart inside. "Welcome to the absolute future of Vanguard Nexus." He opened his mouth to deliver his next carefully rehearsed magnificent lie, but the words never came. Instantly, the massive booming sound system emitted a sharp, deafening screech of static before cutting completely dead. The silver microphone went totally silent. The gigantic floor-to-ceiling high-definition LED screen displaying his handsome face abruptly flickered to pitch black. The famous corporate logo vanished entirely. The entire hall descended into a tense, confused silence. Wealthy investors began to whisper aggressively, shifting highly uncomfortably in their plush velvet seats. Liam tapped the microphone frantically, completely frozen in a state of rapidly rising, suffocating panic. Then, cutting violently through the heavy, suffocating quiet of the massive auditorium, came a sound. It was incredibly sharp, highly rhythmic, and entirely deliberate. Click, clack, click, clack. The unmistakable echoing sound of leather high heels striking the hard stage floor, ringing out loudly from the pitch-dark shadows of the stage wings. The thousands of elite attendees held their breath collectively, turning their heads simultaneously as the steady, imposing footsteps grew louder and louder, moving directly toward the blinding spotlight. The clicking stopped. I stepped firmly out from the impenetrable black shadows of the stage wings and walked directly into the blinding, hot center of the primary spotlight. The stark white fabric of my tailored designer suit seemed to glow under the heavy stage illumination. The massive auditorium, previously buzzing with confused murmurs, instantly fell into a graveyard silence. I did not look like the invisible rustic elderly woman from the Christmas Eve party. I looked exactly like what I was, the absolute architect of their reality. Standing less than 3 feet away from me, Liam physically turned to stone. His jaw went entirely slack, and all the color aggressively drained from his heavily powdered face. He gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto dry land. Down in the front row, the smug, triumphant sneer melted off Chloe's face in a fraction of a second. She dropped the arm of the Zenith Dynamics executive, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror as she recognized the woman she had violently slapped just weeks ago. I calmly reached out and took the silver microphone directly from Liam's trembling, sweaty hand. I turned to face the blinding flashes of the press cameras and the sea of wealthy investors. "Good evening," I said, my voice ringing out crystal clear and completely steady across the massive sound system. "For those who do not know me, my name is Arya Hansen. You have been gathered here tonight under the false pretense of celebrating the genius of the man standing beside me. But tonight, the magnificent illusion ends." A collective heavy gasp rippled through the thousands of attendees. I did not pause to let them recover. I am the original sole founder of Vanguard Nexus. I am the exclusive author and sole legal owner of the core predictive algorithm. I am the anonymous chairman of the board holding 80% of the voting power. And effective precisely as of this exact second, the proposed $1 billion initial public offering is permanently and unconditionally canceled. Total pandemonium erupted in the back rows. Financial journalists frantically typed on their glowing devices, and venture capitalists shouted in extreme confusion. I raised my free hand, and the massive high-definition LED screen behind me roared back to life. But it did not display the corporate logo. Instead, it projected giant, indisputable legal documents in stark black and white. It showed the legally binding sunset clause, the immediate transfer of all intellectual property back to my independent holding company, and a devastating, highly detailed graph showcasing Liam's catastrophic financial mismanagement. "Liam Hansen," I continued, turning my head slightly to look at the broken, shivering man beside me. "Due to gross incompetence, massive unauthorized debt accumulation, and a total failure of fiduciary duty, you are hereby officially terminated from your position as Chief Executive Officer of this corporation. Your clearance is revoked. You no longer work here." Before the crowd could even process the live, incredibly brutal corporate execution, I turned my sharp gaze directly down to the front row. Chloe was already frantically backing away toward the emergency exit, her red silk dress violently swishing around her legs. "We are not finished," I announced, my voice cutting through the rising chaos like a freshly sharpened blade. "Corporate failure is one thing. Federal treason is quite another." I gave a sharp, definitive nod toward the back of the grand hall. The heavy gold-plated mahogany doors swung open with a massive, booming crash. 24 federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, dressed in heavy tactical gear and dark windbreakers, stormed rapidly down the center aisle. The crowd violently parted like the Red Sea, screaming and scrambling out of the way. I looked down at Chloe, who was now trapped against a row of velvet chairs. "Did you honestly believe a secret Swiss bank account could hide the fact that you stole our highly classified trade secrets and sold them to Zenith Dynamics?" I handed every single server log, every offshore wire transfer, and every piece of your explicit correspondence directly to the authorities. No, you cannot do this to me. I am a victim. Chloe shrieked at the top of her lungs, fighting wildly like a feral animal as two burly federal agents grabbed her arms. They slammed her roughly against the carpeted floor, swiftly clicking cold, heavy steel handcuffs securely around her wrists. The press photographers rushed forward like a pack of starving wolves, their cameras flashing blindingly, as the glamorous, treacherous woman was aggressively dragged out of the convention center, her expensive designer heels leaving scuff marks on the floor. Up on the stage, the sheer magnitude of the destruction finally broke Liam. His knees gave out completely. He collapsed onto the hard wooden floor right at the base of the acrylic podium. He curled into a tight, pathetic ball, sobbing loudly and hysterically in front of the entire world. "Mom, please," he wailed, his voice cracking violently in absolute agony. "I am so sorry. I was wrong. Please forgive me. Please save me, Mom." I looked down at the boy I had given my entire youth to. There was absolutely no anger left in my heart, but there was also no pity. I slowly bent down and reached into the interior pocket of my crisp white jacket. I pulled out a single heavily folded piece of paper. It was a perfectly reproduced copy of the illegal high-interest promissory note he had signed with a violent loan shark just 48 hours ago for $500,000. I dropped the paper gently onto the floor right in front of his tear-soaked face. "I gave you an entire empire," I said softly, yet loud enough for the microphone to catch every single syllable. "But you chose a slap. Pay your debts and learn how to be a human being yourself." I stood back up, straightening my jacket. I addressed the stunned, completely silent audience one final time. "Vanguard Nexus will not die tonight. Tomorrow morning, full operational control of this company will be formally handed over to a brilliant, highly capable team of our youngest senior engineers. Furthermore, 75% of my personal annual corporate profits will be immediately diverted to establish a new massive venture capital fund dedicated exclusively to financing female entrepreneurs. Thank you all for coming, and good night." I turned my back on the weeping man on the floor and walked off the stage, my heels clicking steadily into the shadows, leaving the burning wreckage of their completely destroyed lives far behind me. The very next morning, the suffocating, freezing winter air of Texas was completely gone. I stood under the blazing, brilliant golden sun on a pristine private dock in Miami, Florida. The warm, salty ocean breeze felt like an absolute blessing against my skin. I casually pulled a small, expensive leather suitcase behind me. Docked at the end of the wooden pier was a massive, sleek luxury yacht bearing the name The Awakening painted beautifully on the side. I stepped aboard, greeted by a highly professional crew. I took a seat on the plush deck chair, a warm cup of Earl Grey tea resting perfectly in my hands. As the massive engines roared to life and the boat sailed out into the vast, endless blue ocean, I took a slow sip and smiled. I was exactly 48 years old, and for the very first time in my entire existence, I was completely, unapologetically, and spectacularly free. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for staying with me and listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city or country in the comments section below. If you found today's journey empowering and entertaining, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by using the direct PayPal link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your incredible generosity allows us to pay our hardworking staff so they can feed their families, and continue creating even more amazing stories for you to enjoy. Stay strong and have a wonderful day.